She wasn't asking for pity, she was asking for something far braver, someone willing to hold her, not as a widow, not as a woman broken, but simply as herself. The night wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of murmur you only find in gatherings where everyone is trying their best to sound cheerful. Laughter rose in bursts, glasses clinked softly, and the scent of roasted food lingered faintly in the air. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just another evening surrounded by familiar faces. And yet, the moment she walked into the room, something shifted. She was older than most of the women there, though that was never what I noticed first. What struck me was her presence, calm, self-contained, as if she carried with her a world too heavy to be shared with idle chatter. She wore a simple dress, dark and graceful, one that didn't cry for attention but made it impossible to look away once you did. Her hair was swept back neatly, though a loose strand fell across her cheek, softening the lines of quiet strength in her face. People greeted her with polite smiles, some too careful, some too forced. It was the way people act when they don't quite know how to approach someone who has endured loss. She returned their kindness with a nod, a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and then quietly retreated to a corner of the room where the noise softened. I watched for a while, though I didn't mean to. She didn't seem lonely, no, she seemed accustomed to solitude, carrying it like an old coat she had long since grown used to. And yet, I could sense something in her posture. The way her fingers toyed absently with the stem of her glass, the way her gaze moved across the room without ever settling, like a bird hovering on the edge of flight. When I finally approached, I wasn't sure what I intended to say. Maybe nothing at all. But as she turned to face me, her eyes caught mine, steady, dark, and unexpectedly sharp. In that instant, I felt as though she was measuring me, deciding whether I was just another person who would look at her with pity. "Good evening," I said, keeping my tone light, almost cautious. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Evening." Her voice was low, steady, but there was something beneath it, like the echo of an untold story. I offered my hand. She hesitated a fraction of a second before accepting, her palm cool at first, then warming against mine. The shake was gentle but lingered just a moment longer than custom allowed, as though neither of us was in a rush to let go. That small touch, so ordinary in the eyes of anyone else, carried a weight I couldn't explain. In that simple exchange, I felt the quiet gravity of her presence. She was not a woman to be pitied. She was a woman who carried silence like armor, and I couldn't help but wonder what it might feel like if, just once, she allowed someone to step past it. Later that evening, the gathering drifted into smaller groups, voices rising and falling like tides. Some people laughed louder, some leaned closer into conversations that no longer mattered to anyone outside of their little circle. But she didn't join in. She sat slightly apart, in a quiet corner where the lamplight fell softly across her shoulders, as if even the room itself respected the distance she kept. I found myself drawn there, not by boldness but by a quiet pull I couldn't resist. She wasn't hiding, exactly, but she wasn't trying to be seen either. When I sat beside her, the air between us shifted, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like the pause before a question you're almost afraid to ask. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music played faintly from the other room, a tune cheerful enough to feel almost out of place here. She turned her glass slowly in her hand, watching the light catch the liquid, as if it held more interest than anything around her. I studied the way her fingers curved around the stem, elegant, steady, though I noticed how her thumb pressed a little harder than necessary, leaving her knuckles pale. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, quiet enough that I had to lean slightly closer to hear. "Do you ever notice," she said, "how people talk too much when they're trying to avoid saying what they really mean?" Her words caught me off guard. Not because they weren't true, but because they were. And because she had said them with such plain honesty, without a trace of bitterness. I smiled faintly. "All the time. I suppose that's why I'm sitting here. To avoid pretending I care about conversations I don't." That earned me a real smile, or at least the beginning of one. Her lips curved, soft and brief, but her eyes, they didn't quite follow. They remained dark and steady, as though she was still keeping something back. A strand of hair slipped forward across her cheek. For a fleeting second, I had the urge to brush it away, to feel that soft texture between my fingers, but I stopped myself. Instead, I watched as she tucked it back, her hand moving with a grace that seemed practiced, almost ritual. Silence stretched again, not awkward but weighted. She didn't fill it with small talk, and I didn't try to. The quiet itself became something alive, something that pressed gently on the space between us. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't about herself, not directly. She asked me about books, about what I liked to read. Simple questions, but her eyes lingered, as if my answers mattered more than the words themselves. And as I answered, I realized something: she wasn't testing me, she wasn't even trying to draw me out. She was simply listening, truly listening, in a way most people had forgotten how. And in that moment, I felt the weight of her silence not as distance, but as an invitation. The evening air was cooler than I had expected, carrying a faint scent of wet leaves and distant rain that had fallen earlier. The gathering had finally begun to disperse, laughter and footsteps fading into the background. I found her near the doorway, standing just long enough to seem as if she didn't want to leave, yet as if leaving was inevitable. "I can walk you home," I said, trying to sound casual. My own voice surprised me with its steadiness. She hesitated, a small pause that felt deliberate, measured. Her eyes met mine, searching, or perhaps weighing something invisible between us. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "I'd like that," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of relief. We stepped outside together, the door closing softly behind us, and the street greeted us with quiet intimacy. The world had shrunk to lamplight glowing in puddles and the soft echo of our shoes against the pavement. For a moment, we walked side by side in silence. There was no rush to fill it. Each step felt significant, each footfall a subtle acknowledgement of the space we were sharing. Occasionally, our arms brushed, lightly, accidentally, but each time it sent a small, unexpected thrill through me. She didn't flinch, she didn't move away. Instead, her hand lingered near mine, close enough that the warmth of her presence was palpable, though our fingers didn't yet touch. The night was quiet, but not empty. There was a hum in the air, the rustle of leaves in the soft breeze, the faint murmur of distant traffic, even the occasional drip of water from gutters onto the pavement. And over it all, there was the subtle rhythm of her breathing, steady and calm, that seemed to invite a closeness I wasn't supposed to presume. At one point, she looked up at the sky. The moon had climbed high, its pale light casting a gentle glow across her face. She tilted her head slightly, lips parting as she exhaled softly. In that moment, she seemed vulnerable, yet composed, a contradiction that made her impossible to forget. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt intrusive, clumsy. Instead, I just walked beside her, letting the quiet stretch between us without fear or expectation. We spoke eventually, in low, measured tones. Nothing heavy, just observations about the night, about how the city felt under its street lamps, about the simple joy of walking without hurry. Yet even in those mundane words, there was a subtle intimacy, a mutual recognition that neither of us had been entirely present for someone else in a long time. By the time we reached her building, I realized that this walk, this simple act of being side by side, had done more than any conversation could. It had built a bridge of understanding, a quiet trust that did not need to be named. As she fished her keys from her bag, our eyes met, and I felt the unspoken question lingering in the space between us: would this closeness survive beyond the streetlight glow? Her lips curved into the faintest, almost shy smile, and I knew that for now, it had. We stopped at her doorstep, the quiet of the street settling around us like a protective blanket. The street lamps cast a soft, golden glow, pooling at our feet, and I realized I didn't want to move, even though I knew I probably should. The walk had been unhurried, almost dreamlike, and now the world beyond this small threshold felt distant, irrelevant. She turned the key in the lock, then paused, her hand lingering on the doorframe. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled lightly around the wood. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it spoke volumes, a hesitation that said she wasn't just guarding the door, but herself. "Thank you for walking me," she said softly, her voice low enough that I had to lean in slightly to hear. There was a weight in her tone, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, almost fragile. She wasn't just thanking me for my company, she was acknowledging that being here, in this moment, felt important, and maybe even a little dangerous. I smiled gently, unsure what to say. "I'm glad I came," I murmured, keeping my words light, though my heart thumped in a way that made the moment feel too intimate for casual conversation. She looked at me steadily, and in that gaze, I saw something I hadn't expected, a quiet plea, tempered with strength. "Don't pity me," she said, almost as if testing my reaction. "Just, hold me." The words caught me off guard. They were neither bold nor desperate, they were simply honest, stripped of pretense. And in them, there was a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. She wasn't asking for rescue. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for presence, for a human connection that transcended pity or obligation. Without thinking, I stepped closer. My arms went around her gently, careful not to startle her, and she leaned in immediately. Her forehead rested lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against my chest. It was slow, measured, yet somehow trembling, like a fragile rhythm that had survived too many storms. Her arms slipped around me, tentative at first, then firmer, and for a moment the world beyond the doorstep ceased to exist. The hum of distant traffic, the glow of the street lamps, the faint echo of the evening behind us, all of it vanished, leaving only the warmth of that embrace. I didn't say anything. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, I simply held her, feeling the slight shiver that ran through her frame, the gentle weight of her resting against me. And in that silence, a quiet understanding passed between us. This was not pity. This was something far more courageous, an acknowledgement that even in loss, even in solitude, connection could be tender, profound, and wholly human. When we finally pulled back, her eyes met mine with a softness I hadn't seen before. The faintest smile touched her lips, but her gaze held something deeper, trust. And in that trust, I felt the fragile beginning of something neither of us could have anticipated, but both of us desperately needed. After that first embrace at her doorstep, I stepped back slightly, almost instinctively, as if giving her, and myself, space to breathe. But the cool night air that met me felt empty, hollow in comparison to the warmth of her presence just moments ago. I had expected a simple goodbye, a polite nod, perhaps a smile. What I hadn't expected was the quiet intensity that lingered between us, as if the brief contact had opened a door we both weren't yet ready to fully walk through. She didn't pull away or change expression. Instead, she held my gaze, her eyes steady, searching. I felt exposed under their weight, not in a way that made me vulnerable to her judgment, but in a way that made me realize how much I cared about doing the right thing in this fragile, unspoken dance. I started, then faltered. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. How could I articulate the sudden jumble of concern, desire, and fear swirling inside me without stepping too far, too fast? She smiled faintly, not impatiently, but with an understanding that made my hesitation seem almost unnecessary. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. Her voice was soft, yet resonant, carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from experience. "I just needed to feel real again. That's all." Her words settled in me like a gentle weight. They weren't a plea for pity or protection, yet they acknowledged something deeper, a longing for connection, for the kind of intimacy that didn't require explanations or fixes. And I realized that the hesitation I felt wasn't just my own. She was letting me in cautiously, just as I was navigating the line between comfort and overstep. I wanted to reach for her again, to close the space between us and offer that warmth once more, but I paused. My hand hovered near hers, brushing against the edge of her sleeve, lingering there for the briefest instant before retreating. That fleeting contact carried an unspoken question: can we step closer without fear? Can we trust the quiet tenderness that's forming here? She didn't withdraw. Instead, she let her hand remain near mine, a subtle gesture of permission. Her eyes softened, glistening faintly in the street lamp glow, but she made no demand. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotions, the pull of attraction, the hesitation born from past wounds, and the tentative hope that perhaps this connection could be more than fleeting. For several minutes, we simply stood there. No words, no gestures beyond the faint proximity of our bodies and the silent rhythm of our breathing. And yet, in that quiet, I felt something shift. Hesitation wasn't rejection, it was a shared acknowledgement of fragility. A recognition that closeness, when handled with care, could be more profound than any declaration of desire. Finally, she gave the faintest nod, a silent signal that the night wasn't over yet, that this delicate intimacy could continue. And in that nod, I felt a spark of courage ignite within me, the courage to stay present, to hold space for her, and to explore the possibility of something tender, enduring, and entirely real. She opened the door wider than necessary, a quiet invitation rather than a formality, and I stepped into her home. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, calming and familiar, and the soft glow of lamps gave the space a warm, welcoming intimacy. The room was neat, almost meticulously arranged, yet there was a lived-in comfort to it, books stacked on the shelves, a soft throw draped across a chair, and the faint hum of life in the background that suggested this space had been tended to carefully, even in solitude. "I'll make some tea," she said, moving toward the kitchen, and I followed at a casual pace, aware of how every movement felt amplified in the quiet of her home. The sound of water filling the kettle, the soft clink of ceramic against wood, and the faint hiss as steam began to rise, these small, ordinary noises felt charged with a delicate intimacy I hadn't expected. We settled at the table with steaming mugs between us. The aroma of chamomile and honey floated upward, mixing with the warmth of the room. She watched me, but not in a way that demanded attention, more like someone taking the measure of a quiet companion, noticing without judgment, observing without expectation. We spoke softly, tentatively at first. About books we loved, about the way the rain could transform a city street, about small moments of life that are easy to overlook. Each sentence was deliberate, each pause meaningful. It wasn't about filling the space, it was about savoring it, about the weight of presence. I noticed how she would sometimes glance at me from the corner of her eyes, subtle and unassuming, as if testing the waters of comfort. And when our hands brushed against the table, the contact was fleeting but electric, a light reminder that proximity could speak louder than words. I placed my hand lightly over hers once, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly around mine, gentle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more warmth and trust than any declaration could. Her voice lowered as she spoke about the years she had spent alone, the fear of being seen as fragile, and the quiet loneliness that had shadowed her days. There was no pleading in her tone, no dramatics, just honesty, raw and patient. I listened, not as someone trying to fix or rescue her, but as someone willing to hold the space, to acknowledge her feelings without judgment. The room felt suspended in that intimacy. Time slowed, and the outside world, the distant traffic, the faint hum of other lives, faded into irrelevance. It wasn't about urgency or passion, it was about connection, the kind that grows in the silence between words, in the shared warmth of presence, and in the quiet understanding that neither of us needed to perform or explain. As the evening wore on, the conversation softened. I could feel a subtle shift in her energy, relaxation, ease, the way shoulders let go of tension, how a hand resting lightly on the table could carry reassurance. And I realized that this, the slow unfolding of trust, the gentle rhythm of companionship, was the heart of what we were building. Not pity. Not rescue. Just a connection that felt steady, tender, and real. By the time the evening had drawn to a close, a quiet familiarity had settled between us, one that felt effortless yet profound. I knew it was time to leave, but neither of us seemed ready to break the delicate rhythm we had created. The soft glow of her hallway lamp stretched across the walls, casting long shadows that danced like whispers of the night we had shared. She walked me to the door, moving with a subtle grace that made every step feel intentional. Our hands brushed, again, and this time, neither of us recoiled. Her fingers slipped into mine with a natural ease, tentative at first, then firmer as though testing the trust that had quietly grown over the evening. That single touch was simple, yet it carried a weight far beyond its physical presence. It was a promise, unspoken but deeply understood. She looked up at me, and for the first time that night, there was no hesitation in her gaze. It was steady, warm, and open, an invitation rather than a test. I noticed the soft curve of her cheek as she leaned slightly closer, the subtle brush of her hair against my chest. The warmth of her body, the faint scent of lavender lingering from the tea earlier, all combined to create a quiet intimacy that felt like the beginning of something enduring. "I'm glad you stayed tonight," she said, her voice low, but carrying a strength I hadn't anticipated. "Not because I needed someone to rescue me, but because I wanted someone to see me." Her words resonated deeply, settling over me like a gentle tide. There was no expectation, no need for grand gestures. It wasn't about pity or obligation, it was about recognition, about two people choosing to be present with each other in a world that often demanded more than we were ready to give. I squeezed her hand lightly, feeling the firmness and warmth of her grip. "I see you," I said simply, letting the words carry the weight of sincerity. And in that moment, I realized that the slow, careful steps we had taken, through conversation, silence, shared glances, and fleeting touches, had brought us to this point. A point where connection was enough, where presence was enough, where trust and warmth could flourish without needing to be labeled or defined. She smiled then, a smile that was quiet but radiant, brushing away the shadows that had lingered in her eyes since the beginning. Her hand lingered in mine a moment longer, and I felt the soft pulse of her heartbeat echoing alongside my own. It was a small, ordinary gesture, yet it carried everything: hope, comfort, the subtle thrill of something new and unspoken. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt the echo of her touch linger on my skin, a gentle reminder that connection doesn't always arrive with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes, it arrives softly, through hands brushing, eyes meeting, words unspoken, and grows steadily, imperceptibly, into something lasting. For the first time in a long while, I walked home with a sense of quiet certainty. We hadn't rushed, we hadn't forced anything. And yet, in the careful unfolding of trust and tenderness, a new beginning had quietly taken root, one neither of us could have predicted, but both of us had been waiting for all along. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more slow burn romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where quiet connection said more than words ever could? And hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story of love, longing, and gentle beginnings.